Hello and welcome to the Emmanuel Croydon podcast. At Emmanuel Croydon, we exist to be a community drawn together by our desire to know and follow Jesus. We long to become disciples of Jesus who are equipped to serve him in the whole of life, transforming families, communities and workplaces as we love God with heart, mind, soul and strength. We hope you enjoy this week's talk from the morning services. Thank you for joining us today. Grace and peace to you.
Today's reading is taken from the book of Zechariah, chapter 9, verses 9 to 17. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Return to your fortress, you prisoners of hope. Even now I announce that I will restore twice as much to you. I will bend Judah as I bend my bow and fill it with Ephraim. I will rouse your sons, Zion, against your sons, Greece, and make you like a warrior's sword. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. They will destroy and overcome with sling stones. They will drink and roar as with wine. They will be full like a bowl used for sprinkling the corners of the altar. The Lord their God will save his people on that day as a shepherd saves his flock. They will sparkle in his land like jewels in a crown. How attractive and beautiful they will be. Grain will make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. As the dart hit the board and Eric Bristow became world champion, Sid Waddell, that's the other famous Waddell, uttered these words. When Alexander of Macedonia was 33, he cried salt tears because there were no more worlds to conquer. Bristow's only 27. Excellent hyperbole aside, in peacetime we've gotten into the habit of ascribing mythical qualities to our sports stars, raising them to almost divine status. We often excuse and sideline any number of sins in favour of sporting greatness. Tyson Fury's homophobic attitudes, Tiger Woods' infidelity, Messi and Ronaldo's tax evasion. Their redemption stories bear no relation to their original sins. Instead, their achievements in their fields at least partially seem to erase their misdemeanours for many of us. If you think this is the preserve of sports and entertainment stars, then we need to have a think about our relationship with historical figures. At a time when we're thinking about statues and public reminders of our history, it's worth revisiting our own tendencies to wear rose-tinted spectacles of our former leaders. Given that he's remembered for the defeat of fascism in the 40s, as well as some banging oratory, I'm all in favour of keeping our Winston Churchill memorials, particularly that excellent mural in Croydon. But in Britain, we do have a tendency to forget that Churchill was a very real human, morally compromised like the rest of us. As well as military disaster and Gallipoli, he also heavily contributed to the Indian famine of 1943, which killed millions of people. He's not the spotless saviour of some of our stories, and don't get me started on the tube scene in Darkest Hour. Now, I can admit an interest in this. Personally, I welcome nuanced debate around Churchill, but if literally anyone has a go at Alfred the Great, I'm not having any of it. They're making a Viking video game soon, one of my favourite franchises, with Alfred the Great as the bad guy, and I've been in a funk about it for weeks. I reckon we've all got a figure that we worship a little more than we should. But this deification of public figures isn't a new trend by any stretch, and it wasn't always as restrained. In the millennium running up to the arrival of Jesus, various rulers had declared themselves appointed by God or gods to do their divine bidding, and in some cases proclaimed themselves to be living gods worthy of worship of their people. Be they Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian rulers, or Babylon's conqueror Cyrus the Great of Persia, titles like King of the Universe were used to inspire fear and devotion in a subject population. Devotion to political leaders, without being able to acknowledge their failures and their failings, is something we've seen particularly at both extremes of Western politics over the past few years, so we can't exactly call those that came before us daft for doing the same, even if there isn't the godly quality that we give to some of those people. So it shouldn't really be surprising, given that the Jews and the Jewish people had witnessed the rise and fall of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and the rise of the new superpower of the Achaemenid Empire, that they fancied having one of their own supreme anointed leaders to give them the future they wanted for their people. For sure, this was a time of cautious optimism for the people of God. Things were starting to go in the right direction. Their new rulers had ordered the repatriation of the Jews to Jerusalem. Now, many didn't actually want to go back, as they had comfortable lives. But the Persians insisted, partially as they were keen to have an ally on the border of their empire with Egypt and out to Europe in the west. It was during this period that the Jewish people were able to start rebuilding their temple, though not to its previous grandeur, and the idea of their own Messiah started to develop. There were a few different ideas around, that there might be one Messiah, like we would recognise, or two, one more secular and then one more priestly. There was, though, something different about the messianic tradition that gets recorded in the book of Zechariah the prophet. Though, like many of the book's peers, it prophesies the destruction of many of the rivals of the author's state, it also gives a glimpse of a Messiah that's different to what the world might expect, an early glimpse of who Jesus would be. The king that Zechariah prophesies will come lowly and riding on a donkey. Now, we know that story of Jesus from the Gospels on Palm Sunday. This king won't be a successful warlord necessarily, despite the military language in the passage. He won't be born into royalty. That's not how he's known particularly, other than his descendancy from David. But rather, he will come from a more humble place. It is prophesied that this Messiah will rule over a large kingdom. But this Messiah will be a king of peace, a freer of prisoners. It's starting to sound a lot like Jesus. Now, this passage is not without its problems. Having done a few of these going deeper things now, this is by far the hardest passage I've had to work through. We know quite little about this time period in comparison to some of the other parts of the Bible and Old Testament. We're not exactly sure when this book was written, and it's very possible bits were added to it at a later stage. For example, Zechariah was active during the building of the Second Temple, so we're talking about 520 to 515 BC, but there's also a strong reference to Greece, somewhere not really on the radar of the Judeans at this point, and not even on the radar for the Persians for another few years, the Battle of Marathon coming in 490 BC. It's also telling that there seems to be a little confusion in this passage as to whether God is a God of peace or a God of military might. This has caused a little confusion over the authorship of this part of the book, and is a decent example of why anyone telling you the Bible is easygoing or without self-argument or complexity just hasn't looked hard enough. There's also a number of quite ambiguous phrases in the text, which we can't fully understand the meaning of. Sometimes in these passages the subtext is lost to us over time. The interesting verse in this passage is verse 12, which says, "Return to your fortress, you prisoners of hope. Even now I announce that it will restore twice as much to you." Well, there's two interesting things here. The first is that expression of return to your fortress. Now, it may well be deliberately ambiguous. The word used for fortress is the same as the word used in Isaiah 26, where the term strong city can be found in the NIV translation. In Isaiah, the stronghold referred to is the Lord, and that is bound up in the language of a physical city. I think what Zechariah is encouraging his people to do here is return to the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem, at the same time as rebuilding the city and its temple. For our author, he probably deliberately wants to entwine the two together for emotional and political effect. I'd also like to have a look at the expression prisoners of hope. It's quite an evocative phrase, but even from the original text, it could have a number of different meanings. The first is perhaps the most obvious way of looking at it, that because of God's promises, the people of God could be considered prisoners of the Persians, the Achaemenid Empire, but could be considered prisoners of hope, that is, to have hope in spite of captivity. Along the same line, Zechariah could be defining the Judeans by their previous captivity under the Babylonians. The second answer might be that this is a word to Jews reluctant to part from their comfortable life and the religious practices of Babylon. Zechariah may well be calling on these people to return to God and return to Jerusalem to restore it out of their prison of hoping things would be all right the way they are. The third answer might be something more unusual to our ears today. This is where it either gets interesting or boring, and depending on your perspective. A prisoner of hope might be exactly that. Someone who hope keeps prisoner. You see, we're a fair way away from Paul declaring three things remain: faith, hope, and love. In most of the ancient world, hope wasn't seen as a virtue like it is in the Christian world today. Rather, it's actually a negative quality and the preserve of fools and those with no agency. Around the time of Homer, a couple of hundred years before tonight's text was written, the Greek poet Hesiod composed a story of Pandora's jar. We normally call it a box today, which is a mistranslation. In this story, Pandora, created by Zeus as the first woman, opens the jar through greed. And out of this jar pours all of the evils of the world: sickness, strife, toil, the only way is Essex. Only one thing remains inside the jar: hope. The implication of the text is that hope, as well as being an evil, may in fact be the very worst one, or at least the one which is easiest to reach. The idea of hope as an evil continued into the Roman imperial era, where followers of Stoicism, including Emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius, considered hope to be the reserve of the poor of money and of mind. This school of thought has continued into the modern world as well. Karl Marx wrote that he saw hope, particularly religious hope, as a tool for keeping the working class in their place, where hope in the second coming stopped the unhappy and downtrodden from rising up. Some modern capitalist thinkers believe that religious hope removes people's aspiration to acquire wealth, which for them can be considered a problem. Christianity has, to a certain extent, reinvented and championed hope as a positive virtue. In his letter to the Romans, in both chapters 5 and 8, Paul tells his readers that they should not be ashamed of hope, because it's God's love in us that has put it there. He writes that we can hope not only in spite of, but perhaps because of, our own suffering, as we look forward to renewed creation and our own restoration. Augustine of Hippo, all Algerian Christian thinker, definitely not a hippo, expanded upon Paul's teaching on the relationship between hope and faith and love. He believed that hope was necessary, specifically the hope for God's future promises, in order to end up in a position of faith. Because God is good and at work in the world, for a believer to have hope stops it being negative or neutral and actually becomes a virtue. It is this belief in hope as a good thing that leads Christians to different beliefs about the world. It is hope in a better tomorrow that leads us to campaign for it today. It is why churches across the world and history have campaigned for positive change. It is why the church today wants to join in the Black Lives Matter campaign, despite its own internal problems and its history. It is why we believe that the purpose of our judicial and penal system is not just punitive, but restorative, seeking to reform rather than solely punish the criminal. It is no coincidence that hope appears in tonight's passage so close to a reference to releasing the prisoners. For a people of God, many of whom believe they have been overcome and imprisoned because of a failure to listen to God and his prophets, the idea of the Messiah gives them a tangible idea of hope. A large enough land to call home and ensure peace. A perfect king without the shortfalls of their rulers of old. It is only in the light of Jesus, his life, death and resurrection, that we see this perfect king will not only rule the Jewish people, but the whole world, and not only exist for a golden age period of time, but forever. Today, imagery of being a prisoner in a time of lockdown might feel closer to home than usual. Now, lockdown for some of us has been okay. Some introverts I know have really enjoyed working from home and not having to see people very much. You might have been spending more time with your family. However, other people might be finding this really tough. You might have been spending more time than usual with your family. You may have a business or job that depends on things returning to normal. You might be an extrovert who gets energy from other people, and you might be missing your loved ones. Well, the good news is that in light of the way we see God working from the Bible, and in light of Jesus fulfilling the promises of the Messiah in a greater way than thought possible, we know that we will be set free. As Paul teaches, within suffering, we can have our hope renewed. All this will end, and all will be well. If you wanted to take something practical from 20 minutes on the concepts of hope and the Messiah, then how about spending some time over the next few days in reflection? If you wanted to do something practical and meaty, why not put effort into thinking about our own attitudes towards those imprisoned and in need of God's hope? We might think about offenders in this country, how being stuck in a room on our own isn't actually the holiday the Daily Mail tells us it is, even if we've got a TV to watch or an Xbox to play. We might think about God's desire to restore people in his creation. So you may like to consider starting a donation to a Christian prisons charity. I can heartily recommend Langley House Trust, who work with and rehabilitate offenders. Or we might want to think more about political or religious prisoners, like the Jewish people were in exile, and educate ourselves on the injustices in the world today, such as the over 1 million Muslims held in re-education and forced labour camps by the Chinese Communist Party. You can, of course, do what you like, but there's a couple of suggestions if you're lost for things to think about. But what I would like us to remember is that whilst we have faith in Jesus for what he has done already, it is good and right for us to have hope in what God is still to do in the world. If we want to have heroes, there's only one really worth having, and that's Jesus. As the Jewish people in Zechariah started believing that their Messiah was coming, so too can we hope for him to come again and restore the world to as it should be. Amen.
Thanks for listening to the Emmanuel Croydon podcast. For more information about our church and everything we have going on, visit our website, emmanuelcroydon.org.uk. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram to to see and hear what's going on in the life of our church. God bless you and have a wonderful week.